That content in RuneScape, should it be removed? And before I actually start talking about the content itself and what should be removed or not, I think that we actually need to define what constitutes as that content. Because I think that a lot of players have different definitions of what that content ends up being, what is or what isn't. So that content to me is pretty simple. It's content that no one uses. I think that a lot of players like to talk about that content as any content that isn't part of a meta, and I think that there's a difference between content that isn't part of a meta and content that actually no one uses. So that content to me is content that simply doesn't get any use anymore from literally anyone in the game. It's sitting there doing nothing. So now the question comes, should we delete that content from the game? Should we just remove it entirely? And while there are a lot of opinions in this, I think that my personal one simply belongs to no, really. I think that from a even dev perspective, it's probably easier to just try and make a piece of content have some appeal. You don't need to make it the meta again, as long as you make it a niche use that people still use. I think that's already job done. Than to just remove it and replace it. And I think there's really two problems with removing content. One of them is a bit more, I guess, emotional and related to the joy of the game versus, actual gameplay related, which is I feel bad to see content just being removed from the game. It makes it feel like dystopian to a point, because if content gets removed when it no longer gets used, it makes it feel like every content that is in the game, there's no attachment to it. At the end of the day, if you look at Varrock, for example, and you think the only reason as to why it's there is because it gets use out of the players as opposed to actually being a part of the game that you actually go and interact with and plays into your immersion, that's a bit dystopian. Points of the game existing purely for gameplay aspects, and as soon as that gameplay is no longer relevant, it gets deleted, makes it feel really dystopian for some reason. It makes it feel really mechanical in a way. Like, I know that most people, when they play RuneScape, they end up mostly paying attention to the gameplay side of things, right? But the world of Gielinor is still a world. People like its lore and its stories, right? And the NPCs within it. So removing something just because it doesn't get any use anymore, it's kind of weird. As well as, I think that personally, it's just not a very good thing to do from a gameplay perspective either. When you look at a piece of content and you look at its history, and instead of just removing it, you actually rework it and you work on it to make it more relevant, I think that that feels much better personally than just remove it entirely from the game. And it's not even that hard to do that. I know that as a rule of thumb, RuneScape 3 does have far more, I guess, death content than old school, but it's not necessarily impossible to revive it anymore. I know that RuneScape 3 players are a bit more focused on efficiency, so reviving it is not as easy, but looking at old school, there was a lot of content that no one really used, until one thing came around. And that thing was the collection log. The collection log revived more pieces of content than anything Jagex could have done. And all the collection log is a place that tracks what drops you have gotten in the game. That's it. It's as simple as that. And yet it was enough to revive minigames, to revive parts of the game that no one cared about before. And look, granted, I'll give you this, they are not still very popular in the grand scheme of things. Players actually do interact with them nowadays. There is actually people engaging with them, and as a result of there being people engaging with them, ultimately Jagex actually ends up caring about them, because what I think happens a lot in RuneScape 3 is the fact that because something isn't meta and people don't use it, Jagex doesn't pay attention to it. And because Jagex doesn't pay attention to it, the content is super outdated and as a result clunky to engage with. And because the content is outdated and clunky to engage with, players don't engage with that piece of content. And because players don't engage with that piece of content, Jagex also doesn't give it any attention. And it ends up being sort of this feedback loop until eventually the content gets removed and replaced by something else. Look, I know that the Sawmill really didn't have a lot of fans and that 443 is a good skilling place, but ultimately the main problem with the Sawmill was that it was so outdated, but so outdated that yeah, I mean, no one actually used it. But I really wish that instead of Jagex just replacing it with something else, they would have done more work in it to incentivize players to go into it. And I know that a lot of times the systems in the game, like for example the lack of a collection log, does impact the fact that no one will ever care about it and it seems like wasted developer time. But at the end of the day, if you don't care about the places in the game, what attachment do we have towards them? Should I get attached to the GE when someday it can just get replaced if no one else uses it? When it's a place that I actually really love about the game? Yeah, sure, no one uses Varrock that much anymore when it comes to the Grand Exchange, but I like the place. I don't want it to just see removed someday, you know? So I think that Jagex has actually much more to gain from just trying to actually appeal to players and make the older stuff a bit newer without necessarily needing to replace it. And sometimes simple systems like the collection log is all players need to justify interacting with old pieces of content. And when you have players interacting with old pieces of content and giving you feedback on what is good or bad about it that you can fix, it makes it much easier to then fix those places for people to then in the future engage with, as opposed to just removing it and making it feel like you actually don't give a fuck about any place in the game or anything that it has to offer. So ultimately, I don't agree with actually replacing content because, oh, it's dead content. Yes, sometimes it makes it feel like the world is dead, but I feel that from an immersion perspective, the fact that that piece of content might not have any players anymore but used to is part of the history of the game. And it's part of the history of the game as in the Gillenor history, not just like the player history of the game. And that contributes to a point for the enjoyment of it, for its immersion. I don't think that the places in the game should just get treated as gameplay hubs that after no one's using it, we can just dispose of. I think that just shows a lack of care for the game and a lack of care for a lot of updates. And I think that you can then, as a result, sort of uh, it gets reflected on the newer pieces of content that seem that there's no care put into them because it just feels like as soon as they're out of the meta again, Jagex just going to replace them with something else. So ultimately, I don't like pieces of content being removed from the game, regardless if they're that content or not. I'm much more of the opinion that Jagex should try and rework it. And yeah, sometimes the work you're gonna put in is not gonna justify the return you're gonna get. But do you care about this game or not? Do you care about the content in it or not?